December 19, 1944, inside a drafty, repurposed squad room in Verdun, France. The air was thick, not with the fog of war, but with the suffocating weight of impending disaster. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, stared at a map that showed the impossible becoming reality. A massive jagged tear in the Allied lines, where the German army was pouring through the Ardennes with a ferocity that threatened to snap the Anglo-American alliance in half. The room was populated by the most powerful men in the Western European theater: Omar Bradley, Jacob Devers, and George S. Patton, yet the silence was deafening, broken only by the scratching of matches and the distant, dull thud of artillery that signaled the collapse of the front. They were facing the greatest German counteroffensive of the war, a desperate gamble by Adolf Hitler to capture the port of Antwerp and encircle 4 Allied armies, and the mood was one of grim resignation because standard military doctrine dictated that halting such a massive armored spearhead required weeks of defensive preparation. Eisenhower turned to the man known for his flamboyant pistols and reckless aggression, asking a question that was largely rhetorical, expecting a conservative estimate of relief in perhaps 4 or 5 days. But George S. Patton did not deal in conservative estimates or standard doctrine. Leaning forward, his eyes narrowing with a predator's focus, Patton delivered a sentence that would reverberate through the halls of history and fundamentally alter the strategic calculus of the Second World War. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, he growled, a statement so detached from the logistical realities of moving 250,000 men that the other generals in the room suspected he had finally lost his grip on sanity. To understand the sheer magnitude of this moment, we must rewind the clock and analyze the catastrophic failure of intelligence that allowed the Wehrmacht to assemble an iron fist of 30 divisions right under the nose of the Allies. Just 3 days prior, on December 16th, the ghost front in the Ardennes had erupted in fire and steel as Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt unleashed the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies through terrain that Allied planners had arrogantly dismissed as impassable for heavy armor. The Americans had been caught completely off guard, lulled into a false sense of security by the belief that the German war machine was broken, fueling a complacency that ignored the quiet buildup of Tiger tanks and SS Panzer Grenadiers in the dense evergreen forests. While London and Washington were already planning victory parades, the German High Command had achieved total operational surprise, utilizing the heavy winter fog to nullify Allied air superiority and smashing into the bewildered 106th and 28th Infantry Divisions with the force of a tidal wave. The result was chaos on an industrial scale, with American units disintegrated, communications severed, and rumors of German commandos dressed in American uniforms spreading paranoia behind the lines. In London, Winston Churchill watched the pins move on his map room wall with a deepening sense of dread, realizing that his favored commander, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was advocating for a tidy defensive withdrawal that would cede ground to buy time. Churchill, a man who had weathered the Blitz in the darkest days of 1940, found himself grappling with the terrifying prospect that the war could be prolonged by another year, or worse, that the alliance could fracture under the pressure of a renewed German offensive. He needed a miracle, but his military advisors offered only caution, citing the freezing weather and the impossible road networks as reasons why a rapid counterattack was nothing more than a fantasy. Yet unknown to Churchill or even Eisenhower, the miracle was already in motion, orchestrated by the one man the British High Command viewed with a mixture of admiration and deep suspicion. George Patton had done something that defied the reactive nature of his peers. He had listened to his intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, who had spotted the subtle indicators of the German buildup weeks before the first shot was fired. While other commanders were reacting to the shock of the assault, Patton had already engaged in a feverish session of contingency planning, codenamed Flash, instructing his staff to prepare for a radical 90-degree pivot of the entire Third Army. This was not merely shifting a few battalions. It involved disengaging 3 full corps from combat in the Saar region, spinning them northward on icy single-lane roads, and hurling them directly into the flank of the German advance. The logistical complexity of such a maneuver was staggering, requiring the redirection of 133,000 vehicles and over 60,000 tons of supplies in the middle of a blizzard, a feat akin to turning a speeding battleship on a dime inside a bathtub. When Patton made his promise at Verdun, he wasn't guessing. He had already issued the warning orders, his fuel trucks were already turning their engines, and his tank commanders were already studying maps of Luxembourg and Belgium. The skepticism in the room at Verdun was palpable, with a British liaison officer whispering that Patton was a magnificent liar. But Eisenhower, desperate for any option other than retreat, gave the order, "George, if you can do it, go." The moment the meeting adjourned, Patton rushed to a telephone and barked a code word to his temporary headquarters, unleashing a kinetic chain reaction that would become the stuff of legend. "Play ball," he shouted, and instantly the Third Army ceased its eastward push into Germany and began the most complex logistical maneuver in the history of American warfare. This was the moment where the cause, the German breakthrough and Allied unpreparedness, collided violently with the event, Patton's impossible turn. Back in London, the first reports of Patton's claim reached Whitehall, and Winston Churchill, chomping on his cigar, read the telegram with an expression of utter disbelief. He had spent years mediating between the cautious, methodical approach of Montgomery and the brash, often reckless enthusiasm of the Americans, and now he was being told that an entire army was rotating 90 degrees in the middle of a snowstorm to attack within 2 days. "Gentlemen," Churchill muttered to his war cabinet, his voice tinged with a newfound awe, "it appears General Patton has just promised Eisenhower the moon. Either the man is a military genius or a magnificent lunatic, and I suspect he is both." The Prime Minister's skepticism was well-founded because the conditions on the ground were nothing short of Napoleonic in their misery, with temperatures plunging to zero and roads turning into sheets of black ice that sent Sherman tanks sliding into ditches. The movement of the Third Army was a logistical ballet performed in hell, with military police directing traffic at crossroads while suffering from frostbite, and fuel trucks skidding through blinding snow to reach tank battalions that were running on fumes. Patton, riding in his open Jeep with his face wrapped in a scarf, drove relentlessly up and down the columns, screaming at officers to keep moving, famously declaring that the enemy is suffering the same weather, but we are moving and they are not. This psychological dominance, this refusal to accept the limitations of reality, began to permeate the rank and file, transforming freezing, exhausted soldiers into a relentless force of nature. They were moving toward Bastogne, a critical road junction where the battered 101st Airborne Division was encircled and holding out against overwhelming odds, becoming the Alamo of the Ardennes. The Germans, intercepting radio traffic, initially dismissed the movement as a localized retreat or a minor reshuffling of forces, unable to conceive that an entire army could change its axis of advance so rapidly. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, sitting in his headquarters, scoffed at the intelligence reports, confident that no Allied commander possessed the audacity or the logistical capability to strike his southern flank so quickly. This arrogance was the fatal flaw in the German plan, a plan predicated on the assumption that the Allies would react slowly and predictably, allowing the panzers to race to the Meuse River before a counterattack could be organized. But as the lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division began to smash into the German screening forces near Arles, the realization began to dawn on the German high command that the equation had fundamentally changed. Churchill, receiving hourly updates via the ultra-decrypts, watched as the impossible timeline began to materialize into hard fact, noting with astonishment that Patton was actually ahead of schedule. "Third Army is moving faster than our own intelligence can track them," a British liaison reported, forcing Churchill to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the speed of armored warfare. The Prime Minister realized that he was witnessing a new form of warfare, one where time was treated as the most critical resource, more valuable than ammunition or fuel. This was the Blitzkrieg turned against its inventors, executed with a purely American industrial fury that swept aside the caution of traditional military doctrine. As December 22nd dawned, the Third Army hit the German flank with the force of a sledgehammer, catching the 7th German Army completely off balance. The fighting was savage, close-quarters combat in snow-covered forests where tanks engaged at point-blank range and infantrymen fought with bayonets in frozen foxholes. Patton pushed his corps commanders, Milliken, Eddy, and Van Fleet, to the breaking point, demanding they attack, and then attack some more, ignoring flank security and focusing entirely on the objective, Bastogne. The German resistance stiffened as they realized the threat, rushing reinforcements to the sector. But the momentum of Patton's assault was irresistible because it was driven by sheer will. Inside the perimeter of Bastogne, the paratroopers of the 101st, low on ammunition and freezing in their summer uniforms, heard the distant rumble of artillery to the south and knew that help was coming, not in weeks, but now. The famous reply of nuts by General McAuliffe to the German surrender demand had become a rallying cry, but courage alone could not stop Tiger tanks. They needed Patton's armor. The connection between the desperate defenders and the relentless relievers became the focal point of the entire Western Front, a race against time that captivated the world. Churchill, pacing his study at Chartwell, remarked to his physician, Lord Moran, "The man treats time as ammunition. He spends it aggressively knowing you can't save it for later." This observation marked a profound shift in Churchill's thinking, a realization that the cautious, casualty-averse approach of Montgomery might be prolonging the war rather than winning it efficiently. The event of the relief operation was exposing the cracks in Allied doctrine, proving that risk-taking, when calculated and executed with violence of action, was superior to the methodical accumulation of supplies. As the 4th Armored Division's Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the future namesake of the M1 tank, led his task force toward the village of Eisenhower, the final barrier before Bastogne, the stage was set for the breakthrough. The Germans had established a ring of steel around the town, digging in anti-tank guns and infantry to crush the American paratroopers, unaware that a steel hammer was descending upon them from the south. The collision at Eisenhower was apocalyptic, a swirling melee of tracer fire and exploding propellant as Abrams's tanks charged directly through the German minefields and artillery barrages, refusing to stop for anything. They were executing Patton's intent to the letter: hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. The violence was necessary, the speed was essential, and the risk was absolute. On December 26th at 4:50 p.m., the impossible happened. A tank from the 4th Armored Division broke through the encirclement and linked up with a sentry from the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken, the corridor was open, and the German plan to split the Allied armies had been irrevocably shattered. The news flashed across the Atlantic and the Channel, arriving in London like a thunderbolt. Churchill, reading the confirmation, sat back in his chair, the smoke from his cigar curling around his face, and simply said, "Good God, the man actually did it." This was not just a tactical victory, it was a strategic revelation that would force a reevaluation of every plan for the invasion of Germany. The consequence of this operation was about to unfold, extending far beyond the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the conference rooms of Yalta and the post-war doctrine of NATO. The link-up at Bastogne was less a finish line and more the opening of a wound that would bleed the Wehrmacht white. While the headlines in New York and London screamed of victory, the reality inside the narrow corridor forged by Lieutenant Colonel Abrams was a claustrophobic nightmare of flying steel and frozen mud. The German High Command, now fully awake to the catastrophe unfolding on their southern flank, reacted with the fury of a cornered beast, redirecting division after division to sever the lifeline Patton had just established. This was the moment where the tactical brilliance of the impossible turn transformed into a grinding test of wills, a contest not of maneuver, but of endurance in conditions that broke machines and men alike. For Winston Churchill, watching from the warmth of the cabinet war rooms, the relief of Bastogne was the definitive proof that the center of gravity in the war had shifted irrevocably from British caution to American aggression. He read the reports of the fierce counterattacks against Patton's flanks, attacks that would have compelled a traditional commander to halt, entrench, and reorganize, and marveled at Patton's response, which was to order his commanders to attack the attackers. This offensive defense, a concept alien to the methodical advance aimed for by Montgomery in the North, relied entirely on the psychological hardness of the troops and the audacity of their leader. Patton understood what Churchill was only just beginning to grasp, that in modern mechanized warfare, momentum is a form of armor. If you stop, you die, but if you keep moving, the enemy's targeting cycle can never quite catch up to your reality. The corridor into Bastogne, often no wider than a few hundred yards and swept constantly by German artillery fire from the surrounding hills, became the artery of survival for the 101st Airborne, but it also became a graveyard for the Panzerlehr Division. The Germans threw their last reserves of elite armor against the Third Army's positions, leading to surreal tank duels in the snow-draped forests where visibility was measured in feet and survival was measured in split seconds. Yet, despite the ferocity of the German assault, the corridor held, anchored by the logistical miracle that Patton's staff had pulled off in the preceding days. Trucks laden with penicillin, plasma, and 155 howitzer shells ran a gauntlet of fire, guided by drivers who had not slept in 72 hours, fueled only by coffee and the terror of failing the old man. This logistical triumph was the invisible consequence of the operation, the aspect that military historians would later study with awe, realizing that Patton had effectively rotated the supply lines of a massive army while under fire without creating a single bottleneck. It was this capability that shattered the German strategic worldview. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted that the speed of the American logistical reorientation was the shock that broke the German spirit. They could fight American tanks, and they could endure American bombing, but they could not fight an enemy who could seemingly teleport entire supply depots across the map at will. The realization rippled up the chain of command to the Eagle's Nest, where Hitler's delusions of splitting the alliance were finally dissolving into the bitter reality of defeat. On December 28th, a somber meeting took place between Hitler and his senior military advisor, General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg. Guderian, reading the situation maps that showed Patton's aggressive probing attacks expanding northward from Bastogne, had to deliver the news that the offensive was effectively dead. "My Führer," he reported, the words heavy with the implication of doom, "the Americans have achieved a mobility that exceeds our own. We are no longer the masters of speed." It was a devastating admission for the creators of modern mobile warfare, a recognition that the student had surpassed the master, not through superior tanks, for the German Tiger and Panther were still technically superior to the Sherman, but through superior operational tempo and command flexibility. While the Germans grappled with their impending collapse, a different kind of conflict was brewing within the Allied High Command, a clash of egos that would threaten the unity of the coalition just as victory came into view. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose northern group of armies had acted as the anvil to Patton's hammer, held a press conference on January 7, 1945, that would go down in history as a masterpiece of unintentional arrogance. Standing before the world's press, Montgomery described the Battle of the Bulge as a tidy operation under his personal control, implying that he had rescued the distressed Americans and essentially painting Patton's heroic drive as a supporting effort to his own genius. The reaction in the American camp was nuclear. Bradley was practically apoplectic, and Patton, who had just pulled off the maneuver of the century, threatened to resign if Montgomery wasn't silenced. Churchill, the consummate politician, found himself in the agonizing position of having to soothe American fury while preserving the dignity of his own top general. He realized that Montgomery's failure to give credit where it was due stemmed from a deep-seated insecurity about the shifting balance of power. Britain was exhausted, bankrupt, and running out of men, while America was flexing muscles it hadn't known it possessed. In a masterstroke of diplomacy, Churchill went before the House of Commons on January 18th and delivered a speech that deliberately corrected the record, lavishing praise on the ever-famous American Third Army, and specifically highlighting the Bastogne relief as a feat of arms that no other force could have accomplished. It was a public rebuke of Montgomery wrapped in the velvet of parliamentary rhetoric, and it cemented Churchill's private conclusion that Patton, despite his flaws, was the sword the Allies needed to finish the war. The relationship between Churchill and Patton was distant. They met rarely, but a mutual professional respect began to bridge the Atlantic divide. Churchill saw in Patton a reflection of his own ancestors, a throwback to the Duke of Marlborough, a man who viewed war not as a bureaucratic exercise but as a grand, terrible canvas for heroism and risk. During a private dinner with his chief of staff, General Alan Brooke, Churchill mused that while Montgomery was a brilliant manager of battles, Patton was a force of nature, a commander who could sense the turning of the tide before it happened. This philosophical shift would have profound consequences for the final months of the war, as Churchill began to push Eisenhower to unleash Patton for a race across Germany, fearing that the Soviet Red Army was advancing too quickly from the east. The success at Bastogne had emboldened Patton to push for an immediate drive to the Rhine, arguing that the German army was in disarray and that we can cross the river before they even know we've left Luxembourg. This aggressive posture terrified the more conservative planners at SHAEF, who were still fixated on broad front logistics and flank security. But Churchill began to advocate for Patton's view. He saw the Iron Curtain descending long before anyone else, and he understood that every mile of German territory Patton captured was a mile that would not fall under Stalin's boot. The impossible turn had proven that the Allies could move fast. The question now was whether they had the political will to do so. As the winter thaw turned the roads into rivers of mud in February 1945, the Third Army did not slow down. Instead, it accelerated, using the lessons learned in the Ardennes to tear through the Palatinate in a campaign that remains a masterpiece of aggressive maneuver. Patton's logistics officers, the unsung heroes of Bastogne, had now perfected a system of rolling supply that allowed tank columns to operate up to 50 miles ahead of their main depots, capturing German fuel stocks to keep the engines running. This was the consequence of December fully realized, an army that had unlearned the bad habits of caution and embraced a doctrine of relentless speed. When Patton finally reached the Rhine, he didn't wait for the massive set-piece buildup that Montgomery demanded. He simply crossed it on the run, urinating in the river as a gesture of contempt for the obstacles that were supposed to stop him. Churchill loved the story of Patton's crossing, retelling it with glee to his staff, seeing it as the ultimate vindication of the spirit he had tried to instill in the British Army since 1940. It was a stark contrast to the disastrous Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's failed attempt to end the war early, which had been characterized by rigidity and a failure to adapt to changing circumstances. Bastogne had been the anti-Market Garden, a chaotic, fluid situation where the plan was rewritten every hour, and success depended on the initiative of junior officers and the sheer drive of the commander. The lesson was clear. In the chaos of war, a good plan executed violently now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. But the legacy of the Bastogne relief extended far beyond the conclusion of World War II. It became the foundational case study for the defense of Western Europe during the Cold War. When NATO planners looked at the map of Germany in the 1950s and realized they were vastly outnumbered by Soviet tank divisions, they turned to Patton's playbook for salvation. The concept of active defense, rapidly shifting forces to strike the flank of an enemy breakthrough, was directly derived from the Third Army's 90-degree pivot in the Ardennes. Patton had proven that a smaller, more mobile force could defeat a larger, heavier enemy by reacting faster than the opponent could think, a doctrine that would guide Western military strategy for 40 years. The psychological impact on the American military was equally profound. The ghost of Patton haunted the corridors of the Pentagon, creating a cultural demand for aggressive, decisive leadership that viewed logistical constraints as challenges to be overcome rather than absolute barriers. The officers who cut their teeth in the frozen hell of the Bulge, men like Abrams, Maxwell Taylor, and James Gavin, would go on to lead the U.S. Army into the atomic age, carrying with them the conviction that the American soldier, when properly led, was capable of the impossible. They knew this because they had seen it. They had seen an entire army spin on a dime in a blizzard and smash the pride of the Wehrmacht. Tragically, the warrior who had orchestrated this symphony of violence would not live to see the world he helped save. In December 1945, exactly 1 year after his greatest triumph, George Patton lay broken in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, the victim of a freak, low-speed car accident that paralyzed him from the neck down. It was a cruel, anticlimactic end for a man who had courted death on 100 battlefields. A quiet fading away rather than the warrior's death he had always prayed for. When the news of his passing reached London, Churchill was deeply moved, telling his wife Clemmy that there is a great emptiness in the world tonight. Churchill's final assessment of Patton, recorded in his memoirs, stands as the definitive eulogy for the man and the moment. He wrote that while other commanders fought battles, Patton fought time itself, wrestling with the seconds and minutes that make the difference between victory and defeat. The relief of Bastogne was not just a relief operation, it was a testament to the power of human will to bend reality to its desires. It proved that in the darkest hour, when the maps show only disaster and the experts preach caution, bold leadership can rewrite history. As the sun set on the British Empire and rose on the American century, the image of Patton's tanks breaking the snow-crusted horizon at Bastogne remained the enduring symbol of a new era of warfare. Fast, ruthless, and unstoppable. If you were in Eisenhower's shoes at Verdun, would you have trusted Patton's 48-hour promise? Or would you have sided with the cautious British approach? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.